Well, let's open in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you that you have led us to be here, to be able to study your word, to be able to know your will for our lives. I pray that as we study the topic of marriage and why and what and everything that you've put into it for us, that you would guide us and help us to know your will as it's pleasing and as it's good for our lives. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're still in 1 Corinthians. We have moved into chapter 7. And if you've got a Bible, you'll notice the heading is probably something along the lines of Principles for Marriage. And so I didn't want to get into this last week because I figured it would be easier to just take it on to its own thing. But that being said, I also decided, no, we're not going to be able to finish chapter 7 today, so I didn't include all of chapter 7 for the topic today. We'll keep doing that next week as well. As a quick review, the who, what, when, where, and why, okay, of 1 Corinthians. The who of 1 Corinthians is who wrote it was Paul and Sosthenes. And who did he write it to? Well, the church in Corinth. Okay, the what, well, he tried to basically address lots of different things that they were concerned about. And this chapter 7 is one of what they consider the major shifts within his letter, because he starts going very specifically topical at this point, although it is very related to the previous stuff in chapter 6 as well. During his second missionary journey, he visited the city of Corinth. And most likely during his third missionary journey is when he actually wrote this letter. So probably around 55 AD. Okay? The city of Corinth is on the Greek peninsula. That's where it is. And specifically that relates to our letter is it's on an isthmus, a narrow chunk of land separating two larger bodies of water. And so this was a natural seaport that you could dock and unload your stuff and carry them across the isthmus and then reload them on the other side. And then why did he write this? Well, we talked about he's going to address some things within the church, but also just to give teachings on how an undisciplined church can be disciplined, or how a church can see every aspect of life through the lens of the gospel. Okay, any questions before we get started? Okay. So what's going on here? After his plea for unity in chapters 1 to 4 and his discussion of moral problems in chapters 5 to 6, Paul proceeds in the third portion of this letter, chapters 7 through 10, to answer questions submitted to him by the Corinthians. The questions dealt with the application of Christian freedom. In chapter 7, the apostle dwells on matters pertaining to the question of whether or not to marry. His advice represents indirect counseling, since he leaves it to the individual to decide the question on the basis of the Word of God, his or her own ability or inability to cope with sexual desires, and the unsettled conditions prevailing in the Roman Empire. Okay? All right, so chapter 7 starts off. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay, any thoughts right off the top? Okay. And so I already mentioned this whole section about now concerning in verse 1. Basically, Paul is going now to address very specific things that they actually asked him. And so this quotation, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Most likely that's a direct question or comment coming from the Corinthian church. Okay? Which is interesting when you think about it from the Corinthian church, because what did we talk about last week? What is a Corinthian girl, and what is the city of Corinth known for? Anyone remember? Promiscuity. Promiscuity, yeah. They had this huge temple where temple prostitutes was kind of a way of life, and you would go to the temple and have sex with the prostitutes because that would please the gods and bless you and your city and make things more fruitful, and it was part of their life. They didn't even consider it to be an issue. And yet, at the same time, this is a very diverse city, because there's also people within the city that thought that you shouldn't have sex at all, even with your wife, as well. And so there's kind of also, even outside of the Christian church, there was a movement that said that you should be completely abstinent, and that you should never have any sex, which is really weird when you think about a city known for sex. But there was also that as well. They actually had this idea of this ascetic celibacy that they promoted and proclaimed, and some of the Greek philosophers promoted this, and some of that actually kind of got into the church as well. What about the same kind of thing today? Is this same concept in the church today? Yes or no? You got 50-50.
Are you saying about being abstinent from your spouse?
I'm saying being abstinent. Is that in the church today?
What in the Catholic Church is supposed to be? It's not outside the church.
It is. The Catholic Church bases abstinency as the preferred mode. In fact, one of their sacraments is marriage. Why? Because it has to give forgiveness for the sin of not being abstinent. That's one of the reasons why marriage is part of their sacraments, is because they believe all sex, whether it's in marriage or not, is a sinful act, and so therefore they have to get forgiveness for it, and so that's one of the reasons they have this marriage as a sacrament.
By God's command of being fruitful and multiplying if they do sex with the sin.
I'm not saying it's biblically supported. I'm saying that this is the tradition that they've had. Yeah.
Even Paul didn't go that far.
I mean, Paul did say, "I wish that all were like as I am," right? But yeah, no.
But he at least had enough sense to say, "This is me speaking, not God."
Yeah. No, so it's interesting. And then think about this from the other side. What's one of the other sacraments within the Catholic Church?
Free unction. After God.
Well,
You're talking about holy orders.
Holy orders, yeah. And what's tied to a holy order?
This wasn't celibacy.
Yeah, celibacy, right? Yeah. And so this is actually still in the church today. This idea of this ascetic celibacy, a way of being pleasing to God by doing this thing. Okay? As opposed to being pleasing by God, or pleasing to God by following God's law on it, instead it's being pleasing to God by kind of taking the next step and just not doing anything. So, this question, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. That was their statement. That was what the Corinthian church was asking about. And how does Paul address it? He doesn't really. Look what he says immediately after it.
More like a 50-10.
Yeah, he doesn't really say, yeah, this is good. No, he doesn't actually say, yes, this is good. Instead, he says, okay, sure, this is good. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So he immediately moves past it and kind of gets to the larger issue of, okay, whatever, but here's what God has designed, right?
So now wait a minute. Is there a textual basis for considering that statement? It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, to be their question or to be with a woman.
Within the Greek, you don't get the quotations mark. You don't get quotations mark in the quotation marks. There we go. In the Greek, because there is no punctuation in the Greek. In fact, there's not even, if you really want to go back to it, there aren't even lowercase letters. It's all just capital letters. No spaces between words even, which is, really really challenging at times. But the grammar itself, though, implies that this is a statement that Paul is repeating back. Okay, it implies that. You can't like wholeheartedly prove it beyond a shadow of doubt, but it is implied enough that the modern translations put quotations around it to help show the grammar of that. In English, the grammar is the quotations. In Greek, the grammar was embedded in the words themselves.
Here in NIV, there's a footnote that reads like this, and it is in quotation marks where other alternative readings aren't.
That was weird. Because I wasn't breathing in it. Like I even thought my breath was still making the noise. I don't know what's doing that. Sorry. Repeat your question. What was the footnote?
In the NIV, there's a footnote where it says "or," and it reads like this here, and it's in quotation marks.
Okay, but in the text they don't put the quotation?
And in other footnotes where it says "or" something, it doesn't have the quotation marks. Therefore, the quotation marks are part of this alternate reading.
Yeah. Well, in the, let me pull it. So let's look at a couple other ones. Yeah, so the New American Standard Bible does not have the quotation marks. The King James doesn't have quotations, but they set it apart using a colon. The American Standard Version sets it apart with a colon. The Nestle Allen Greek, what verse? Sorry, we're talking verse 1 still, right?
Yeah.
They don't have the quotations. Instead, they do a comma, basically. But the Nestle Allen Greek, what that is they combine all the Greek manuscripts. The scholars get together and say, here's the consolidated manuscript, is what that is.
That's somebody else.
Didn't get it? That's weird. Because, I've done it before where that's been my voice.
Yeah, we think someone who called in.
Someone who's on the phone.
Oh. Okay. But yeah, so that's why it's one of those where it's kind of implied. I just realized, the ESV actually does the colon and the quotations. Yeah.
Well, if you look at the beginning of chapter 8, for instance, where changes to another subject, it's got that forward too.
So let me ask you a question.
Okay.
In this book, which is NIV, it says in verse 1, it's good for a man not to marry. That's what it says in the text. And then down below in the notebook it says, quote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So, is marry and sexual relations with a woman the same word in Greek?
No, the reason they call sexual relations here is the Greek actually says it's good not to touch a woman, but that's colloquial speak for having sexual relations. Kind of like the Old Testament always says he knew her, right, or he slept with her. The literal is not sexual relations, but yeah, it's the implied meaning.
So is this...
You can go back and get something back there for me, though.
Is this so vague in all the language that we really don't know what they're talking about?
No. It's the way you do any type of ancient translation is you compare all the different texts to the surrounding context, and then you go broader to the source of the literature, and then you go broader to the common vernacular of the time. And so this touch a woman, whether you're in the New Testament or whether you're in just ancient Greek literature, that's what it meant, is to have sexual relations with them. Yeah, so it wasn't a matter of, bad interpretation. This was just kind of like when we said, what would be a modern day equivalent?
To sleep with someone.
Yeah, to sleep with someone. Said, oh, did you sleep together? That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about if they have sex, right? That's kind of the way language works. Yeah. And so this one, the Greek, the literal is, must not touch a woman, but the meaning is have sexual relations. And there's lots of things in the Bible that are like that. For example, anytime it talks about, the anger of God burning against someone, especially like the Israelites, right? And the anger of the Lord burned against them. The literal translation is, and God's nostrils flared. but that wouldn't mean anything to us, right? And so the translators say, okay, well, this is what this euphemism means. God's nostrils flared means God was angry with them. And because the reason they do that is the Hebrew language is very, very visual. Well, what happens when you're angry at someone? You flare your nostrils, right? And so that's what they're doing. And there's lots of things within translations that do that same thing. It's just, that's why you can't ever have a perfectly literal translation, because it would be nonsensical to the people you're talking to. Okay. So does that answer your questions there?
Yes.
Okay. So then when we get into verse 2, he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality. Okay? And if you look at the Book of Concord, if you go to the Augsburg Confession, the founding Lutheran document, if you want to call it that, it's what makes us a Protestant. It was our legal protest against the Catholic Church that we gave to the Emperor. The Augsburg Confession says, hey, this is why we let our priests and our pastors and our monks, etc., within the Lutheran Church have wives. And they point out, because celibacy isn't working for you guys, why do you think it's going to work for us? Because they point out in the Augsburg Confession, the stories of the sexual exploits of priests and monks are all over the place. And this is talking about from the 1500s. And then go forward to nowadays, what is almost constantly in the news? All of the failures of the celibacy of the priests and the monks, right? No, it doesn't really work. This isn't something that was God's intention. And oh, by the way, when you don't do something according to God's intentions, it tends not to go so well. And look how much damage that's caused for the church at large, not just the Catholic Church, but the whole church. has been damaged, reputation and other things by things like that. And so this was one of the things that was actually, it's its own section of the Augsburg Confession. Hey, this is why we're doing this. And we laid out this because it just doesn't work. It just does not work. Yeah. Which Paul's pointing out here. But because of temptation to sexual immorality. In other words, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Right? As he puts at, or as he says at the end of verse 9, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Right? God's gift of marriage, God's gift of sex, is a very potent gift. And it's directed in certain ways by God, and if it's not directed, then it becomes just as potent of a sin. Okay? Which is why God's given direction for it. Okay? Any questions before we move on to verse 3?
Go way back.
Okay.
Well, first creating man and woman, he said, for one thing, he said it's not good for a man to be alone. But this is, marriage is not really apparently just a last resort to combat temptation, but God invented it as it was His intention in the first place.
Yep. Yeah. In fact, when Paul points out here, now as a concession, not as a command, I say this, right? He's pointing out, that you can be, abstinent and perfectly happy in this, but Paul's saying this as more of an exception to the norm than the norm. That's why he's pointing this out, is because this is the exception, not the norm. Okay? Doesn't mean that you can't be single and God-pleasing and perfectly wonderful, your whole life in that arena, but that doesn't mean that that's the norm. It just means that that's, one aspect that God might have blessed that individual in. That's fine. Yeah, okay. Any other comments? All right, let's move on to verse 3. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. That is got to be just the worst way of saying that phrase right there. Conjugal rights. NIV says it differently. What does the NIV say?
His marital duty.
His marital duty. Okay? Yeah.
Conjugal rights and what you said.
Yeah, conjugal rights. The ESV I feel like they really chose poorly when they translated that word. This word has nothing to do with sex. This word in the Greek just means you owe someone something. In fact, its most common use is talking about money debt. Okay? It's usually talking about debt, obligations. Jesus, when he says, give taxes to Caesar, and all that, and he says, don't owe anyone anything. This is the same word, okay? In other words, you have, this word says, the husband should give to his wife her rights, her obligations, the things that you owe her. Okay? She has an obligation in this relationship that you owe to her. Okay? And then and likewise the wife to her husband, right? And so it works both ways. As a married couple, yes, you have rights and obligations and debt incurred to each other because you are now one. And as one, you now have not only responsibility to your husband, but you have responsibility to your wife. Okay? Saying it as conjugal rights, the reason they do that is because what's the rest of this paragraph all about? Well, it's about sex, right? And so the implied meaning is that. But conjugal just does not help. Because it makes it sound like, the wife is a sex slave to the husband, and the husband is a sex slave to the wife, which is just not the right connotation for what Paul is going for here.
What is King James?
I think they say something along the lines of marital rights. Give me a second. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. Due benevolence, which is probably closer to the idea of obligation and debt, right? Yeah. But yeah, conjugal, this is one of the ones where I wouldn't have gone this way if I was translating it myself. But that's how they went with the ESV, okay? Look up Romans 13, verse 7, okay, as a comparison here. Where this is Paul talking about submission to authorities. Let every person be subject to governing authorities. For there's no authority except from God. And then go down to verse 7 where he says, pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes, I guess I was quoting Paul, not Jesus. Pay to taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. This word owed here in the Greek is the same word as what they translate as conjugal rights here in the ESV. Okay? To give a better idea of what this word actually means. It's you have certain responsibilities and obligations to your position in life. And that's what they're talking about here. You know, you need to fulfill those obligations and positions. Okay? Okay, and then when you combine this with verse 4, where it says, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Okay? Thinking about this whole idea of obligations and debts, and then, authority over your own body, what biblical understanding about the nature of marriage and relationship is stated in this passage? What would you say is the biblical understanding?
It corroborates the theory that you're actually one.
That you're one. Okay. Yeah. Any other things that you can get out of this? That's part of it, yeah. How is the role and how is the defining factor of being one, how is that couple supposed to operate within themselves then? Looking at this passage, not getting ahead into Ephesians, but looking at this passage. Yeah, you're responsible for the other person, right? You are in a relationship of responsibility and obligation. And that relationship is also as one, but at the same time, you're kind of yoked together in a certain sense, right?
Well, in the same sense that you take care of yourself, your body, and put work into these own things, you're supposed to take care of your spouse's body that way too.
Yeah. Okay, now let's get into Ephesians. So Ephesians 5, verse 22 and 23. And this is always the famous one, right? Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Okay? And then verse 25. I don't know why. Oh, through 33. Okay. I was like, why did I stop at 23? No, through 33. Sorry, the whole paragraph. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up to her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Okay? Adding this paragraph onto this, how does this refine our answer from the previous chunk, from the previous readings? So previously we said they are one. You know, one body doesn't belong to the other, it belongs to the other type of thing. And we talked about obligation and debt. How does this refine that same answer?
Well, it's an analogy between marriage and Christ and the church, which means that we can't do it perfectly.
Okay. It is an analogy, but just because you can't do something perfectly doesn't mean that's not your goal and what you should be striving for. Yeah?
Take care of yourself, also take care of your spouse.
Okay. It's interesting that you use that golden rule, right? Because what did Jesus do to that golden rule? Yeah? Jesus didn't say treat others as you'd like to be treated, but instead he said treat others, love others as I have loved you. Okay? Which is actually saying the same thing in this passage here, right? What's changed suddenly? How do we've got obligation, we've got kind of one ship, but now what's changed or been refined as we read this in Ephesians?
Well, the answer you're struggling to get us to admit to is that the men are in charge. But that's not exactly right if you understand anything at all, say, for example, about welding. If you weld two pieces of metal together, yes, there was a male one and there was a female one, but they are now one piece. So it seems difficult to me to say, oh yeah, this partner is in charge. It's not two people anymore. It's a couple.
It is a couple.
They're together. They are
it
one.
It is a couple. And I'm not trying to get you to say the men are in charge.
Well,
because
seems to me like.
Yeah, because wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Okay? What's the analogy? Remember how in my sermon I said we had a narrative guide? What's the narrative guide?
Jesus died for your friends.
Yes. Okay? Jesus died in sacrificial love for his bride, the church. Okay? So what's the husband's job? If the narrative guide is Jesus, what's the husband's job in the marriage relationship? To sacrificially love his wife, right? And the narrative guide for the wife here is, okay, the wife is the church. What does the church do? What do? We submit to Christ, right? Okay? Is that a negative thing? Does anyone here feel offended that you submit to Christ? Do you feel like you've put yourself in a servant role and that you've demeaned yourself in some way by submitting to Christ?
Even if you did, it seems like a good thing.
Because how did Christ love us? He loved us sacrificially. It's not a burden to submit to yourself to Christ because you know how much Christ loves you. You know how much He did for you, and you know how much He's going to continue to do for you, right? And so if that's your narrative guide, if that's your example for marriage itself, well then that would be a beautiful relationship. That means the husband wouldn't ever make a decision that would benefit himself. He would only ever make a decision that would benefit his wife, and most often would probably be a burden to himself. Unfortunately, as I don't know if Dave or John pointed out, right, we're never going to be able to meet this example, right, because we are flawed, and we are sinful people, right? And so, unfortunately, yes, we break this all the time, and because we break this all the time, that's why we have such messed up relationships. That's why we fight with our wives. That's why we, get into oh, well, I said this 20 years ago, and I'm going to hold you to it. And, yeah, do you have a comment?
Yeah, this was one of my thoughts for the day on my calendar flip. And this woman said, I met my Mr. Right. However, I didn't know his first name was always.
Because we're flawed people, right? And so even in our efforts to mimic Christ in the church in our marriage, we don't do it right. We fail. Well, what's the other part of the Christian life? Repentance and forgiveness. Which means even in our marriage, when we fail to live up to the example and to the model that God has given us, repentance and forgiveness. We should be going to our spouse in repentance, saying, I messed up. That was on me. Will you forgive me? Not a, wow, well, you shouldn't have done it this way. You know, just because I was wrong doesn't mean you weren't also wrong. No! That's not what... We don't go to God and say, God, those laws, they were just too hard. You made them too hard. It's your fault, God. No! That's not how repentance and forgiveness works.
That's what Adam said.
Yeah, that's what Adam said, yeah. This woman that you put with me, God. No! That's not what repentance and forgiveness means. Yeah, so when Paul's talking about, the husband giving his wife her obligations or conjugal rights, and the wife likewise to her husband, right? The underlying background here is God's design for marriage. And what's God's design for marriage? As Paul explains it here in Ephesians, it's like Christ in the church. Yes, someone has to be the leader. Otherwise, if you both said, no, after you, no, after you, no one would ever go anywhere. The husband has to take the stand and say, no, you're the important person. You can go first. And then people say chivalry's dead. Well, chivalry actually has a basis in biblical doctrine, right? The chivalrous thing to do is to always allow the woman to do the thing that's going to benefit her the most, and to take whatever sacrifice you need to do as the man, whether it's your cloak over a muddy puddle, and now you've got a muddy cloak, or whatever, it doesn't matter. That's your job in the relationship as a man, is to do what benefits her the most.
Key word there, benefits her.
Yeah.
Whatever she wants.
Yeah. Again, Jesus does all sorts of things for the church that we might not agree with, right? We might really wish that Jesus would do something else. But that's not how Jesus leads us. He knows what's best for us, right? Here's the other part of that. Husbands, do you know what's best for your wives?
That's another place where we can't measure up.
And so what do you often have to do? Hope, help me out here. I don't know what you need. I don't know what you... Right? You have to communicate it out, because you're, unfortunately, unlike Jesus, you don't know what's best for her all the time, and so you've got to talk to her and see what's going on. I'm not a mind reader, no. And so, yes, wives, submit to your husbands. Okay, people get caught up there because they don't read the rest of the passage.
But honestly, if someone loves you that much and has your interest at heart that much, it's not going to be hard to submit to them. It's not making yourself a doormat. It's just stepping back.
If anything, you think about it, the wives could really, if husbands were doing this sacrificially, wives could probably have a much easier job taking advantage of their husbands. I mean, you think about it, because, I need this, I need that. You could, but then again, are you loving your wife, like Christ loved the church? And so it's this back and forth, right? And so when we talk about, the wife's body belongs to the husband and the husband's body belongs to the wife and all this stuff, yes, that's trying to get at this idea of they become one flesh, right? They are one unit. But even within that unit, you have a head. Even within the body of the church, the head is Christ, right? And why? Because without that, then you wouldn't have any direction. You wouldn't have any order to that relationship. In fact, that's why we call this the order of creation, okay? This is an order that God put in place from creation. It's not something new or unique. This was God's plan at creation. That's why when Adam and Eve sinned, who did God talk to? When Adam and Eve sinned, who did God talk to first? He said, Adam. Right?
Even though he knew who did it.
Yeah. He even knew about the serpent, right? But he started Adam. Adam, what have you done? Oh, this woman whom you put, oh, it wasn't me, it was the serpent. And then he starts the curses in reverse, right? Serpent, woman, back to Adam. Okay? So Adam frames that whole conversation because it was Adam's fault. Because as you know, the president and other people in authority like to say, the buck stops here, right? That's because ultimately the person responsible for it was Adam. Because that was the relationship, that was the order that God put in place. And then you can do all sorts of other things like, well, you know, she gave the fruit to her husband who was with her and all this stuff. Oh, he was right there.
But when you read between the lines, that maybe Adam wasn't minding the story for a while before this happened.
Say it again, he wasn't minding what?
Maybe he wasn't minding the story like he should have been.
Yeah. Well, and you could even argue that he might not even told Eve God's command in its holistic sense, right? Because God told Adam the command not to eat from the tree, right? And then when Eve quotes it back to the serpent, she doesn't quite quote it quite right. And so, again, that was God's order of creation. From day 6, when God finished creating everything, this was the way things were supposed to be. And then from day 7, 8, 9, 10, whenever we screwed this up, maybe a month later, maybe 30 seconds later, we messed it up. And now we've got all the pain and the turmoil because of that. Yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments there before we move on to verse 5? Okay. Verse 5. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I would translate this stop. It's not a do not do something in the future. It's stop doing what you're doing. Okay? It's not a hey, I know you guys know about this, just make sure you avoid this. It's a you're already doing it, stop. Okay? Stop depriving one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time. Okay? Combine verse 5 here with verse 2. Okay? Where he says, because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. What awareness of human nature is Paul revealing in these verses? Thinking about verse 2 and verse 5 together. What's Paul trying to get at here? You think about these two verses where Paul says, because of temptation, you need to have your wife or your husband. And then in verse 5 he says, stop depriving one another. What's Paul getting at? Yeah, back to the whole celibacy thing, right? In other words, you could, as he says, for a limited time, avoid sex to be able to better focus on prayer or things like that. But that's not really helping you in the long run. Okay? God designed sex within marriage because he designed us with passion, with emotion, with desires and needs that are supposed to be godly directed within the marriage relationship. They're not supposed to be directed outside of the marriage relationship. And yet they're going to be there even if you aren't married, unless, like Paul, you have that gift of celibacy, right? So Paul's aware that human nature is going to have this built in because God gave it to us. It was one of God's gifts to mankind. Sex is a gift. But like many of God's gifts, we will abuse it. And we have abused it when we use it outside of his design for it. Okay? And just a side note here, this whole agreeing for a limited time, within the Jewish community, they had these kind of periods of time where celibacy was not only encouraged, but it was also mandatory. Like, for example, when the woman was on her period, it was mandatory that you were not allowed to have sex. That was against the law. And if you had sex, you would be unclean and you could be potentially thrown outside of the nation of Israel. Okay? Other times, especially as you got closer to the New Testament times where Jesus was combating with the legalism of the Pharisees and stuff, is they would say abstaining from sex with your wife for a week was considered a worthy and good practice to devote yourself in mind and spirit and prayer to God, but beyond a week was discouraged. Which I found interesting, since there are many married couples that I'm sure go longer than a week just because of issues within the relationship, right? But for the Jews, it was considered, here's this is a good practice, but beyond this, boy, there's no way you can handle that. You know? So it's interesting how Paul has to kind of address this for a limited time. Okay? And why? As he says here at the end of the verse, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. In other words, let's be realistic, people. We know that you're burning with desire. That's why you need to get married in the first. That's one of the reasons you need to get married in the first place. Use God's gift within the area that God has given you to use it. You know. Any comments or questions?
Most people think Paul is a curmudgeon over all of this stuff. But I think maybe they don't consider that he's answering a question of a problem that was a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then he gets into verses 6 and 7, right? Now is a concession, okay? Although marriage is God's design as part of His creation, it is not commanded that anyone marry, okay? It's not a command that you have to marry. What reasons might someone have for choosing to remain unmarried? Okay, what do you think? What are some reasons why people might choose to remain unmarried? And I know it's hard, but we got to think back, maybe to your college days or to that time period where you're deciding, is this the one? Is this not the one? What are some reasons why you might remain unmarried? Paul gives us one example here. Why did Paul want to stay unmarried? Because he could, yes, but what specific reason why?
Serve the Lord.
So he could serve the Lord, right? He felt like he was better able to serve the Lord. And we'll get more into that next week, where he actually goes into detail of, hey, the married person, rightfully so, has many concerns about his wife and her well-being and all this other stuff, whereas the single person doesn't worry about that. He can just focus on his task of serving the Lord, which is where, the Catholics get the idea of celibacy for the priesthood. Why else? That's one.
There's plenty of what we would call not so good reasons that people think of, like they don't like the responsibility.
Okay. Don't like responsibility. Yeah.
Really a good reason, I don't think.
Yeah. Let's put a biblical lens on here, okay? Unmarried and celibate. Haven't found the right person yet? Okay. Yeah.
But celibacy, as we understand it from today's context, is mandatory.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm not talking about specific to the Catholic Church. I'm talking about just in general. Like, for example, I was engaged to Hope in college and celibate, but we weren't married. I was promised and engaged, but we weren't married. Why weren't we married? No. I did have the, I actually could, because I didn't spend my college savings fund on college since I had a scholarship.
To go to school.
Yeah, I was earning $6,000 a year to go to school. Thanks to Air Force scholarships and state university scholarships. But yeah. Why? Why did I avoid getting married? Yeah, because I knew that if I was married, I would have obligations to my wife, and I needed to get my degree. Hope waited until she got her degree. before she married me. I unfortunately had one more semester. But so she graduated in December. I waited until the normal May. So she did 3.5 years of college and got a degree. I took the full 4. But yeah, so she graduated first, and then about a week later we got married. Well, 2 weeks, I guess. I don't remember when you graduated. But yeah, that's an example. I chose to remain unmarried for that purpose, even though I already knew that I wanted to marry her. I already knew that I wanted to. I mean, I asked her to marry me. But I chose to stay unmarried for that purpose. What other things can you think of? So we got kind of the idea of serving the Lord without distraction. We got the idea of this, kind of college. Can you think of anything else? Why someone would choose to remain unmarried but also chaste?
Financial reasons, maybe.
Financial reasons. Yeah, a lot of people say that Joseph was way older than Mary because he had to first build a life, first build a trade, build income, be able to support his wife. Yeah, especially as you go back in time, that's more and more common. Nowadays, you almost need marriage just to support the household because you need 2 incomes almost for a lot of places. Yeah. Okay. And so now, flipping this question around. So I guess I didn't put this one. Okay, yeah, it's further down. We'll get to that after we get through verses 8 and 9. Okay, so the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Okay? Let's consider 1 Timothy. So go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5, 9 through 14. Timothy 5, 9 through 14. And this is talking about widows and the enrollment of widows within the church, because the church, especially back then, had this kind of special category of, hey, you are without support, so the church is going to be your support. Okay? And he talks about, that they should have a reputation of good works and should be brought up, has brought up children, has shown hospitality. But then he says in verse 11, but I refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, gossips, busybodies. And then in verse 14 he says, so I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. Okay? How does this kind of help understand more fully Paul's overall attitude towards marriage? Because here in verses 8, he's talking about that they should remain unmarried. But now in Timothy, he's saying they should marry. So what's going on here? The young ones should marry. Specifically the young ones who can't do what? What does he say in here in 1 Timothy? Or when their passions draw them away. Right? In other words, same thing as the men. It is better to marry than to burn with passion. Right? In other words, if you are widowed and you're okay with that, and you're in a situation where that's, that can be God-pleasing, then that's fine. Stay that way. But if you're burning with passion, then get married. Don't let this become a hindrance to you. Okay? And that's not just widowed. It would be also the opposite side for the men as well. Right? Okay? Thinking about this now. Describe some life situations today in which you think a couple should remain unmarried, or where a couple should marry despite practical disadvantages. Apparently I did put this on here twice. Oh, what reasons might someone for choosing? Okay. And then we already kind of covered the one side of that. The why should you remain unmarried. What about the other one? That you should marry despite practical disadvantages. Okay? Burning with passion, but you marry, what could be a practical disadvantage there? Can you think of any scenarios? Yeah, think of a scenario. Where could this apply? Maybe you're married, but you're not actually living in the same state. Maybe it's a deployment for military. Maybe it's why would you marry at that? If you're not even able to be together, why would you get married? Why would you do that? Any ideas?
You're fishing, nobody's fighting.
I know. I'm trying to throw the hints out there without giving the answer myself. But yeah. Well, I mean, for example, the deployment with the military is a good example. If you aren't married and your husband or your spouse, or your wife dies while in combat, you have no rights within that. You have no death benefits. You have no anything.
You have no say over what happens.
You have no say over what happens, right? In fact, in the military, you wouldn't even have any health care. Because in the military, you have to be married to even get the health care from your spouse's job, right? Okay, so it could be practically very difficult to be married to someone in the military, and yet at the same time, there's a lot of reasons why you probably should be married, even beyond just the burning of passion thing. Okay? What are some other examples? Maybe you want to buy a house together. Whose house is it? If you're not married, well, then you got all sorts of legal problems, all sorts of other things, even though you might not be living in the same state, or maybe you are living in the same state, right? Marriage is part of the reasons and the logic for all of that, too. You think of any other things.
Well, there's practical disadvantages, if you want to say practical, to getting married altogether in the first place, because you're not your own boss anymore.
Yeah.
And yet, that's outweighed in many people's minds by the advantages.
Yeah.
Not only economic advantages, but the intellectual and mental advantages.
Yeah, I mean, you could be single and adopt children, but there's a lot of advantages to being married and having children, right? Because, as I said, it takes a community to raise a child, right? Or in our case, Hope doesn't work and earn an income, but if she didn't stay home, then we would have thousands and thousands of dollars of child care. And so there's it's just, there's no advantage for one of us not staying home with the kids, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to live as a family. We wouldn't be able to have a family, right? Instead, as a unit now, we're able to raise 5 kids. Some modicum of success, at least. We try, at least. So just trying to get, there is reasons beyond just the burning with passion. There are reasons, for marriage outside of just kind of those common things. And there's also reasons for not marrying, as well, okay? Let's go to the next chapter, or verse 10. We're getting on to more stuff here. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, it basically gives the laws to the Israelites about divorce. It says, if a husband wants to divorce her wife, he must give her a certificate of divorce, and all this different stuff, okay? If a Christian does separate a divorce, Paul references Matthew 5, verse 31 through 32, and then Matthew 19, verse 3 through 2, right? Because he says, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Okay, he's referencing the Gospels, and where Jesus himself talks about marriage. So let's look that up. Matthew 5, 31 through 32. And then after we get through this, we'll stop here, because we're running out of time. Okay, it says, "It was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Kind of harsh, right? Now let's move on to chapter 19, verse 3. "And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?' He answered, 'Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.'" Okay? They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with a wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it." Okay? So, according to Paul, according to Jesus, you get this interesting scenario where divorce is quite challenging. Okay? He calls for that a person to remain single or, if possible, to be reconciled to that separated spouse. So in your opinion, what reasoning lies behind this direction? Why would both Paul and Jesus speak like this? And yet Moses spoke differently. In fact, if you want to get into the Jewish tradition, the Jews said you could give your wife a certificate of divorce even if she burns your supper.
No.
How is this? Why is that no longer the direction from Paul and from Christ?
Well, it's a trivial reason.
Trivial reason to divorce someone? Not only that.
Burning this, it's,
Yeah.
you had to have not liked her in the first place and wanted to get rid of her.
Yeah. There's the reality of a Christian marriage is not based upon, whether or not that person is, worthy of that relationship, or whether or not that person is fulfilling that relationship. The reality is instead, you've been commanded by God to make this work, and so you need to do everything in your power to make this work. And then you're given exceptions, right? For sexual immorality, for abandonment as well. And we'll get into the unbelieving and believing one next week. But it's not just this frivolous commitment. Marriage is intended to be for life. Okay? If it isn't, well then there needs to be a reason for that. So much so that I've even seen some secular, non-Christian marriage counselors say that even an abusive relationship is not grounds for divorce if the abuser is willing to actually work on it. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I've heard even non-Christian secular counselors say that. That depending on the even physical abuse sometimes, they'll say that that's still a marriage that can be saved. Now, there's different levels, and I'm not qualified to even get into the levels because I'm not anywhere near psychologically and trained in those arenas. But even to that extent, someone who's not even a Christian says, "Hey, some things can actually be worked on." But again, not a blanket ticket either, right? Because what does Jesus say? Right? He says, pull it back up, right? Anyone who divorced, where is it? Yeah. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Okay? In other words, hey, there are reasons, and there's other places where it talks about abandonment, but the point is this isn't a frivolous thing. It's a challenging thing. But yet it's also a gift that God has given to man, which is a blessing as well. Any final comments or questions before we close? All right, well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we have failed. We have failed to live according to the ways that you would have us live. We failed to love our spouse in the correct way. We failed to respect our spouse in the correct way. We failed to even stay married at times as you would have us. And so, Lord, we ask for forgiveness. We ask that you would bless us in your word, that you would bless us with knowledge to know how we are to live our lives. And when we fail, Lord, grant us forgiveness. Help us to know your grace, your love beyond measure, where it does not depend on our success or failure, but on your love, grace, and mercy. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, thanks, everyone. That was it's a big topic, and we're only halfway through the chapter. So we'll get more into it next week. Thanks again for coming, though.